Hello and welcome to this session from Aralez. We, Chris, de Ploeg, and Chihiro Chris are co-founders of Aralez, a decolonial organization that dedicates itself to strengthening coalition and deepening understanding of the struggle to decolonize. We're based here in the Netherlands, and today we will be looking at a zine from 2012, Israel's worldwide role in repression. So in the past year, a lot of people have been doing a lot of learning about Israel and its detrimental role in colonization of Palestine. And today we'll be unfolding a little bit more about its role in genocide, military abuse of human rights in other parts of the world and its wide extensions. So without further ado, we will read this part by part by country. There are a lot of countries that Israel has played a role in. This zine is from 2012, and it was made by the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. And afterwards, we'll do a little bit of an update. We'll have a little bit of a conversation about what we see has happened since 2012. So without further ado, we'll start on reading the role of Israel. And we'll also link below the zine, the link if you want to download it. Let's go.
The sections that follow give evidence of Israel's role in supporting and facilitating the repression done by other aggressors around the world. In the Middle East, Israel is the primary aggressor. Locally, Israel does not sell to its own neighbors, but uses its own weapons and technology against them. While Israel exports its instruments and strategies of mass murder, repression, and incarceration outside of the region, within the region, it perpetrates all three. Israel exports what it uses to repress and dominate Palestinians and perpetrate aggression against its neighbors. The following are some of these tools, technologies, methods, and weapons.
1. Training of police, military, and militia. 2. Systems of surveillance used to criminalize populations considered potential threats to the legitimacy or security of repressive states and regimes. This information is used for mass incarceration, deportation, assassination, torture, and forced removal to secure land or resources. Methods of isolation. 3. Methods of isolating populations through forced migration and destruction of land into concentrated areas whose airspace, borders, parameters, and telecommunications are controlled. And 4. Militarized borders and border technology used to prevent freedom of movement.
Central and South America. Israel has sold its signature firearms, the Uzi submachine gun and the Galil rifle, in countries throughout the region, arming Guatemalan death squads, Nicaraguan Contras, Pinochet's Chile, and the military junta in Argentina against the population and their movements.
We will now list the countries of South America and Central America. 1. In Nicaragua, Israel provided 98% of the arms Somoza used in the last year of his dictatorship to kill 50,000 Nicaraguans.
Israel also sold missiles, fighter jets, and armored vehicles and provided counterinsurgency experts to the repressive forces listed above, as well as the dictatorships in Honduras and El Salvador.
In Costa Rica, as early as 1981, in addition to selling arms to the police to repress the population, Israel provided passports, aliases, and arms to Contras operating out of Costa Rica against the people of Nicaragua.
In El Salvador, the Histadrut, Israel's National Labor Federation, cooperated with the United States, AFL-CIO, and the CIA to undermine rural cooperatives.
In the zine, you find more information about the Histadrut. In El Salvador, Israel was involved in training the military, police, and death squads of the dictatorship beginning in 1972. It developed a youth military program sponsored by Israeli Defense Force and supported counterinsurgency training for secret police, including the military commander Sigifredo Ochoa, who was responsible for civilian massacres in 1981.
As early as the 1950s, Israel sold small arms to Dominican Republic dictator Rafael Trujillo, who subjected the Dominican people to a 31-year reign of terror.
In El Salvador and Guatemala, to assist the government's tracking of suspected opposition, Israel introduced computerized equipment to monitor telephones and to interfere with the radio transmissions. The information gained was then used by right-wing death squads to assassinate opposition figures.
Borrowing from its long-standing tactic of displacing Palestinians, Israel helped plan and implement scorched earth policies in El Salvador and Guatemala. In Guatemala, these policies were combined with development poles, so-called development poles, concentrated villages of displaced populations that allowed for greater government control over the popular movement and the repression of any grassroots organizing. Israel provided small arms and military training to Colombian paramilitaries and drug traffickers in the 1980s, and since that time has provided counterinsurgency training, aircraft, missiles, and small arms to the brutal Colombian government.
The Pinochet dictatorship of 1973 to 1990 that murdered, raped, and tortured opposition in Chile, including trade unionists and socialists, bought Israel's weaponry for crowd control, including vehicles fitted with water cannons. Through the 1980s, Israel also provided surveillance to the Pinochet regime.
In the 1970s, Israel armed the brutal military regime of the Argentinian junta that imposed 7 years of state terrorism on the population, including the torture and disappearance of an estimated 22,000 to 30,000 left-wing activists, trade unionists, students, journalists, and other alleged anti-regime civilians.
The Argentinian regime and its supporters also targeted its Jewish civilians and espoused anti-Semitic rhetoric. Although just 2% of Argentina's population was Jewish, between 10 to 15% of the people who were arrested, tortured, and disappeared during the junta were Jewish.
Rather than condemn the junta, Israel worked with the Argentinian government to establish a program called The Option, allowing Jews to flee to Israel. It used, rather than confronted, the regime's anti-Semitism to facilitate Jewish immigration to Israel.
Today in Argentina, the government has a contract worth $40 million with the Israel Military Industries, IMI, to set up a prison.
The Israeli government and corporations play a significant role in Brazil's domestic policing, crowd control, surveillance systems, military arms, prisons, and militarized borders. The police training and arming is part of Brazil's anti-favela campaign and other domestic repression.
Brazil has contracted with Israel to provide an advanced surveillance system and its state's prison system.
Israel, we're going to Africa now. Israel armed Portugal against national liberation movements in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau.
Israel funded and trained the military repression of anti-colonial uprisings and/or dictatorships in the Ivory Coast, Central African Republic, Benin, Cameroon, Senegal, Togo, Uganda, Nigeria, and Somalia.
In the neo-colonial civil wars, former colonial powers and current imperial powers fuel, arm, and even instigate these wars to divide and reconquer Africa. Israel has armed many or all sides. A prime example is Israel's arming of the 3 sides of Angola's civil war at different times over 4 decades.
During the brutal Mobutu regime in Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, Israel sold Mobutu arms and trained paratroopers, the Presidential Security Force and the military, thus building the power of this pro-Western dictator.
In Malawi, from the 1960s to 1980s, Israel provided training to tyrant Dr. Banda's army of boys used for murdering political opponents, terrorizing workers by flogging and torturing opposition.
Starting in 1992, Israel sold arms and later provided training to Rwandan military and Hutu militia that in 1994 perpetrated genocide against the Tutsis. Israel continued to send millions of US dollars in arms even after the genocide was attracting international attention.
Currently, Israel maintains strong ties with the Equatorial Guinean government ruled by President Obiang, who seized power in 1979. Obiang is believed to have ordered the deaths of thousands of Guineans during his period in power and to have headed one of the most tyrannical regimes on the continent. Equatorial Guinea, with a population of 800,000 and now flooded with petrodollars, has purchased from Israeli companies tens of millions of dollars in naval and aircraft.
We're going to White Rhodesia, present-day Zimbabwe. Israel remained an ally of the white colonial apartheid state of Rhodesia until its defeat by the anti-colonial movement in 1979.
After UN imposed sanctions against Rhodesia in 1967 and through the late 1970s, Israel continued to maintain trade with the apartheid regime and provided with arms, including Uzis and helicopters, in addition to helping Rhodesia manufacture its own submachine gun models called Ruzis. Israel helped Rhodesia fortify its borders by installing a landmine belt that was 500 miles long.
Apartheid South Africa. Israel was a staunch ally of apartheid South Africa. Arms sales to South Africa included Uzis, missile boats, Gabriel missiles, communications and radar technology, ammunition, and drones. Not only did Israel arm the South African government, it also provided arms and security training to some of the puppet Bantustan governments.
Israel also helped fortify South Africa's borders by setting up microwave detection systems, radar systems, minefields, and even electric fences.
The Histadrut had a near monopoly over Israelis' trade with apartheid South Africa and eagerly collaborated with its Bantustan policies. ISCOR, a joint South African Histadrut company, produced steel and tank armor. Companies wholly or partly owned by the Histadrut helped build an electronic fence to prevent anti-apartheid guerrillas from entering South Africa.
In 1960, the Histadrut formed the Afro-Asian Institute for Labor Studies and Cooperation, funded by the CIA through the AFL-CIO. The institute was designed to train Asian and African students to assume positions of leadership in their native labor movements. The incentive for both US and Israeli state labor organizations was to forestall the formation of independent workers' organizations in favor of labor organizing that served the building of neo-colonial states in former colonies.
In the late 1970s, Israel was credited with providing the information, the techniques, and the materials for building of nuclear weapons by South Africa.
Several Israeli kibbutzim profited from the repression of the black South Africans. Alongside the Israeli state-owned factories, turning out material for South Africa was Kibbutz Beit Alpha, which developed a profitable industry selling anti-riot vehicles for use against protesters in the black townships. Mishmar Hemek produced helmets for the apartheid army and police, and Lohami Hagetot, known for its Holocaust museum, operated a chemical plant in the KwaZulu Bantustan.
And it continues. We're going to Southwest Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific. From the point of view of our existence and security, the friendship of one European country is more valuable than the views of all the people of Asia, was a quote by David Ben-Gurion in 1957.
In Iran, during the rule of the Shah, Israel served to protect this brutal US puppet regime. In turn, the Shah was one of the first leaders of the region to recognize Israel as a state. During the Iranian Revolution that overthrew the Shah, Israel sold over 150 million US dollars in arms to the regime.
From 1954 on, the Shah secret police received training from the CIA and Israel.
Israel participated with the US in the Iran-Contra scandal and also sold arms to Iran separately.
During civil wars in Yemen and Oman, Israel supported Arab dictatorships by providing war material and training to them. Israeli involvement was coordinated with the United States.
The Israeli government and Israeli corporations have provided tens of millions of dollars worth of naval and aircraft, including drones, intelligence training, electronic warfare technology, and ship-to-ship missiles to the Sri Lankan government in their efforts to destroy Tamil groups demanding an independent homeland in the northern part of the country. Tamils are 70% of Sri Lanka's 16 million people.
In 1978, Israel sold US jets and attack helicopters to Indonesia, as the military carried out genocide against people in East Timor. From 1978 to 1999, the Indonesian military killed more than 200,000 Timorese. Israel arms trade with the Suharto dictatorship continued until his resignation in 1998.
Israel gave support to the US-backed Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines. It supplied bodyguards for Marcos and provided covert trainings or courses through private companies.
India purchases more Israeli arms than does the Israeli army. Israel is the second largest supplier of arms to India. India uses these arms not only to threaten Pakistan, but to repress its own population, including the Jammu, Kashmir, forest tribes, and Naxalite resistance groups amongst them.
In 2009, Israel sent instructors to train police in India in a strand of counter-terrorism that specifically targeted Muslim leaders.
Israel has recently been helping India to modernize its military forces, including Falcon planes, with Israel-made warning systems, aerostat radars installed on the India-Pakistan border, and enhanced Barak missiles for use against aircraft, helicopters, and cruise missiles.
To finish off, we are going to the United States. Israel and the United States share a form of settler colonialism in which the indigenous people, rather than being exploited primarily as workers, are ethnically cleansed, and those remaining are segregated and isolated into shrinking areas.
Like so many countries, the US purchases Israeli weapons of war to use against others outside its borders, and Israeli technologies, surveillance, and policing strategies to use in repression internal to its borders.
Zionist organizations within the US, through programs funded by the Department of Homeland Security, have partnered with the US government to target Palestinians and other Arab, Iranian, and Muslim communities and organizations. Related propaganda has made way for and fueled growing vigilante violence against those communities.
The influence of these government-funded organizations on national security policy is integral to other policies that have significant and far-reaching effects for all living in the US. Most impacted by policing, political repression, surveillance, and immigration policy are communities of color and immigrant communities. Also targeted are those who express and otherwise engage in dissent.
Since 1949, the estimated cumulative total in US direct aid to Israel ranges between 115 billion and 123 billion US dollars. The US gives Israel approximately 3 billion per year upfront in economic and military aid. This aid takes away from the ability to meet domestic needs, including education and healthcare.
In the past 2 decades, the Anti-Defamation League, a Jewish Zionist organization founded to combat anti-Semitism, has participated in surveillance of over 1,000 social justice and human rights organizations, including opponents of South African apartheid. the United Farm Workers Union, the Vanguard Public Foundation, Labor Council, AFL-CIO, and NAACP, MADRE, Greenpeace, and the Center of Constitutional Rights.
Elbit, the Israeli company that built the apartheid wall in Palestine, participated in the design and provided surveillance technology for the US-Mexico border wall, commonly known as the Wall of Death.
Made possible by US government anti-terrorist funding, the Israeli government and corporations, as well as the US-based Zionist organizations, have collaborated with and trained local police, the National Guard, and the Department of Homeland Security in repressive tactics, including surveillance and crowd control. For example,
since 2003, the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, has trained almost 700 senior-level law enforcement personnel representing over 220 different agencies on so-called extremist and terrorist threats. In 2010 alone, the ADL trained over 10,500 law enforcement officers.
Following Hurricane Katrina, a 25-member delegation from the National Guard went to Israel. The purpose was to train them in maintaining order after natural disasters and terrorist attacks.
Since 2005, the Department of Homeland Security has provided anti-terrorist funding to US-based nonprofit organizations to involve them in identifying and preventing terrorist activity, so-called terrorist activity. Of funds given to non-governmental organizations specifically for this purpose, 73 to 80% is received by Jewish Zionist organizations. In 2008, this meant that 19 million out of 25 million US dollars went to these organizations. In 2011, it was 50 million out of 19 million US dollars.
So that's a bit of an overview in 2012 of different regimes, different oppressive regimes that Israel has had its military ties with, has profited from funding or had an interest in. I am joined here today with you, Chris. Maybe it's good to first say something about ourselves in how we enter this conversation.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start, I guess. So as we already mentioned, we're both co-founders of Aralez, kind of decolonial, anti-colonial organizers. Aside from that, I'm also a writer. I'm generally involved in all kinds of different organizing, including Palestine organizing. And I'm an anti-imperialist writer. I write a lot about international justice, about US imperialism, and obviously Israel plays a huge role in that. So I've also published several articles about that. Yeah, that's a little bit about my background.
Yeah. And then for myself, I would say I've been protesting militarism since 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, but there's not really been a peace movement in the Netherlands, so I've never really developed that muscle of anti-militarist activism much, and developed further as a climate justice organizer since 2009, always with an angle of decolonizing and kind of seeing how we got into the climate crisis through a colonial relationship with land and life and people, and that scorching earth and the effects that we're now living have something to do with one another. And yeah, I would very much like to open it with kind of this reflection of what I've seen a lot in the past year is a lot of people coming to organizing for Palestine, right to exist, and for liberating Palestine. And still kind of surprised that so many countries are endorsing Israel. And kind of if we look at Israel's military relationships, I believe I've read that they had 130 countries listed to which they have military ties. we can maybe see part of the puzzle of entanglement and complicity. I wonder, where would you like to start this this analysis?
So the question is basically why does the global north, especially, I mean, there are other governments as well, of course, but why do they support Israel, right?
Yeah. How are those relationships?
Right.
How do you see those relationships?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, Israel as a settler colony, like many other settler colonies, like the United States, like Australia, are some of the most aggressive forces within imperialism. I think it has always been that way. Um, and basically they're kind of like the shock troops. And they play a vital function within imperialism. So we went through a whole laundry list of, Israel's aggressions. But maybe one example to zoom in on, for example, would be in 1967 when Israel invaded several neighboring countries and basically brought the fall of Nasserism and pan-Arab socialism. And there are many critiques about how socialist this really was, but I think at least scholars like Ali Qadri and others have demonstrated at least there were real advances in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of basic socioeconomic rights that were guaranteed.
And it's seen as a kind of like a tipping point for US. Like before Israel was really supported by the UK in its, like, it always depended on a big imperialist force backing up this settler colony.
Yeah.
And like 67 or around that time has really been seen as the switch where the US was the major endorser of Israel in a Cold War kind of situation.
Right. And this is no coincidence because basically, I mean, you obviously saw a little bit of the shifting alliances already happening before, but 67 is a key turning point, and that's basically when the US decided it was very clear, pan-Arabism was moving more towards the left. It was getting closer to communism and socialism and the socialist bloc. And they didn't want to do this balancing act anymore because they saw that Israel could just destroy its neighbors. And it was a key turning point for the entire Arab region, which basically started drifting towards neoliberalism after that, because the whole project was kind of disgraced because of that military defeat. So you kind of see Israel, at least in that specific role in that region, playing a very key counter-revolutionary role. And I think if we would zoom in on the politics of many, so we mentioned a lot of dictators, we mentioned a lot of paramilitaries, but those aren't just, random dictators. They tend to be neo-colonial regimes, they tend to be counter-revolutionary regimes, they tend to target leftist social movements, people trying to turn the tide of history in a better direction. And I think this is the key way to understand Israel's role and why the global north is supporting it, because they are having that key role. And in fact, they are in some sense some of the most aggressive ones. So the countries that we mentioned, Nicaragua, which was a very brutal paramilitaries, they killed children, women indiscriminately. And in fact, there was at some point a military embargo announced. It just became so toxic to support them that the US couldn't do it openly. So Israel could kind of then fill in that role to be a kind of backdoor channel to bring arms to the Contras. And we've seen them play similar roles with similar regimes. So I think
there are some countries that's been said by different people that have observed these things, that the US wanted to fund something but didn't want to be held responsible for it, and Israel would kind of take that role of I believe with Guatemala being another example of Rios Monts that was really leaning on Israeli support, where 200,000 Mayan people were killed, and also really seeing that there is a pattern of killing indigenous people. And that's like no surprise when you look at Israel as a settler colony that is also threatening indigenous people that they identify with other forces that are settling. Also Serbia and Bosnia, they identified with Serbia. And there was also so one of the things with the embargoes, you mentioned an embargo, right? Like
Right.
the arms embargo.
Yeah.
And so there was an arms embargo like recently, a few years back, against Myanmar, and Israel was also supplying weapons to Myanmar, that is suppressing the
Rohingya, yes, yeah,
population.
yeah.
And the question of getting away with all of this, like how do you view that? Like other examples are Rwanda. There was a UN security embargo, Bosnia, South Sudan, in Israel involvement, very strong for decades, funding rebels to destabilize the regime in Khartoum. Yeah, there are these examples of where there was an embargo.
Yeah.
Like there still is an arms embargo against Israel, which is insane. But there were examples, and how do you view them getting away with that over and over again?
Yeah, so I guess this comes down to like why doesn't the West, punish Israel, so to say,
Anybody,
or anybody? Well, I mean, I do think at least if you look at like in general at UN resolutions, the world has been speaking out against Israel repeatedly. There are a lot of UN resolutions condemning Israel, whether it's about their oppression of Palestinians or their role in other countries. But the main problem is that they are backed by the most powerful military force in the world, basically mostly NATO and some aligned countries, which, spends more on the military than the rest of the world combined. So in terms of actual teeth, the UN General Council doesn't actually have any teeth. And the Security Council.
So then maybe this is where we bring it home. How do you see the relationship between the US and Israel? There's a lot of different argumentations that I've also seen online. People who are talking more about the US wanting Israel as a pawn in the Arab world and for oil interest. There's more around Israel lobby being more to invade the US, kind of that way. And there are more sides to this story in terms of looking at the US-Israel military buddy-buddy situation. But I was wondering.
Yeah, and there's also the guilt analysis that's often thrown around.
Yeah.
So
that's not.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can go through them maybe one by one.
So maybe first to set us off, Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of US foreign aid, as the country has received 297 billion between 1946 and 2023, most of which is in military aid, according to the data from the US Agency for International Development, USAID, reported by the Council of Foreign Relations, CFR. This is coming from Anadolu agency reports, and that is in a context being the largest recipient of US aid, that actually Israel is the 9th biggest export of arms in the world in absolute numbers, and the 2nd biggest export per capita, and also being the 13th largest economy per capita.
Right.
So it's like a rich country receiving a lot of military aid.
Right. So it's obvious that Israel has a special relationship with the US. This is without, you gave the numbers. But I do think so. The whole idea that this is kind of, Israel controls the US or something through the lobby, I think we need to be very critical of that for several reasons. I mean, there is a big lobby. This is without a doubt. If you look at just, foreign funding of Congress members for their campaigns, I forgot the exact numbers, but they are huge. You can find them quite easily. It's the same in the UK. In many countries, in the Netherlands right here, we have, of course, for the PVV, there's Zionists funding the far-right PVV party. But that being said, I mean, you cannot explain that kind of intensive backing just through lobbying. For example, it's very obvious that the oil lobby has always also paid and lobbied extensively, but nobody would say that we are in a climate breakdown just because of some oil lobbyists, right?
Yeah.
We are in a climate breakdown because the interests of the oil corporations perfectly align more generally with capitalism and imperialism. And I think that is also how we need to understand the relationship between the United States, or NATO more generally, and Israel. Because if we look at all those, this laundry list of countries where Israel supported counter-revolutionary forces, which is the other country that supported all those counter-revolutionary forces? Obviously, it was the US, in many cases, even more ferociously, because they obviously have more money and more weapons. So yeah, I think some of them have even said this quite openly. Biden has in multiple cases said, like, if there wasn't an Israel, we would have to invent an Israel to protect our interests in the region. And I would say it's not just the region there, but it's more generally as a counter-revolutionary force in the world. But of course, it does have extra added value as being also a kind of imperialist attack dog within a very specific region where a lot of the oil and trade routes are concentrated. So it's not just the oil production, it's also the Suez Canal through which a lot of the trade goes. And I think it's comparable in that sense maybe to a country like Rwanda, where also the US has been backing to the hilt Paul Kagame, which has been committing genocide in the Congo since 1906. Estimated 6 million people have been killed. Israel has also been supporting Paul Kagame. So Israel supported both the previous Hutu regime, and then afterwards they started supporting Paul Kagame as he started killing massively Hutus, but also more generally people in the Congo. But you see a very similar role there, that Paul Kagame and Rwanda are kind of playing an imperialist role within that region, securing, for example, coltan mines, which are then kind of brought into all these international supply chains for military technology, for modern technology, our phones, our laptops, almost everything is powered with that. And also coltan is very concentrated in the Congo, so it has this similar kind of very strategic role. So I mean, there are multiple layers to it. But definitely lobby, it's kind of turning it around, and I think it's a bit damaging to think that this small country of a few million inhabitants is dictating world policy, because then that would also really make us strategically blind. That then if you just solve the lobby, then we wouldn't have all these problems with imperialism anymore.
So I'm gonna read a few things, and I love your response. So one thing comes from an interview to discuss Israel lobby and the nature of US-Israel relationships with Rania Khalek, joined by Richard Becker, the author of the book Palestine, Israel, and the US Empire. And he kind of states that Israel is a tiny country and a giant military base. And what Israel has been able to do for the United States, Israel is a European implantation to the benefit of imperialism in the heart of the Arab world. It is an essential element from point of view of the Pentagon and White House for global domination. And then he kind of talks about the differences between Israel's priority being a land-hungry regime and the US global empire, and the US managing the largest empire ever existed, and like seeing Israel as instrumental to doing that. Like in 2004, the US had in its military documents that their goal was full spectrum domination. That's quite literal, like it's kind of
the US has been
Orwellian.
saying that for a long time.
So like Noam Chomsky has been pointing at that, like it's not even hidden anywhere. It's kind of like full spectrum domination. That means control over the entire earth, and Israel just fulfilling a part of that vision of a global empire. So that's one kind of view that I wanted to bring into the conversation. Another view is from Noam Chomsky, where this is already a little bit older, like 7 years ago or something, or I'm not quite sure that was from something else, but a few years ago, where he looks at the relationship between the US and Israel, and he notes 4 things. So first, he mentions Christian Zionism, and the Bible said, and like it being a big thing with the elite of UK and US. The second is heart of colonization. USA, Australia, Canada are all settler colonizations and have been backing another settler colonization. Surprise. These are like hearts of colonization states. And then on the third point, Noam Chomsky mentioned that in 1948, the State Department and the Pentagon were slightly different, that the State's Department was concerned about refugees that it was causing with the Nakba, but the Pentagon was mostly impressed with Israeli military potential. And so that, yeah, since then, obviously in the 60s, that has kind of merged into a full-on support. And then the fourth thing Noam Chomsky mentions is destabilizing secular Arab nationalism by Israel's like providing a huge service to the USA, and yeah, then kind of seen as an offshoot of US militarism. And then there is a thing that I saw about 10 years, a 10-year deal with the USA for a package of 38 billion for Israel. And it was under the Obama administration or something. And that actually it wasn't that much of a difference because it was already all like 3.8 billion a year. And it was like for 10 years that was almost the same. But some of that nitty-gritty of that agreement was that Israel couldn't apply for more funding unless it was in war, which I found kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And some other thing that was kind of something that Israel kind of had to swallow in that deal, that the US probably wanted more than Israel.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, since now, like it's kind of obvious that Israel wants a full-on war with the region. Like they've been provoking that.
Yeah.
It was kind of obvious already 10 months ago when they said they could change the face of the map.
Yeah.
They said that I think in October somewhere. But now with the attacks in multiple countries in the region, how do you look at that escalation of war?
Yeah, so to be fair, when I said before that the interests of Israel and the wider imperialist blocks align, it doesn't align perfectly, obviously. So I do think there are some tensions in that relationship, which is normal. Also, if we look historically, like why does the United States exist, right? It was a settler colony from Great Britain, and at some point there were tensions between the interests of the settler colonists and Great Britain. Much of the tensions were actually about how far they could go in their extermination of Native Americans, and basically, you know, they rebelled against Great Britain partially on that basis. So you often see that the settler colonists tend to be the most aggressive and think that the larger colonial metropoles don't really understand them, don't, you know, understand these barbarians and what they need to do with.
They don't
Exactly,
see the
exactly.
reality.
And so you do have that dynamic. But I do think I want to bring maybe one different aspect though of specifically the relationship between or the function that Israel has in the last, let's say, since the 7th of October. So we already went into how Palestine is kind of a laboratory for repression across the world. But of course, there's this very specific thing that happened after 7th of October, which is that it wasn't a concentration camp anymore, or was also a concentration camp. We're talking about Gaza, of course, but it became also a death camp. And some writers have been saying, and I think this is a legitimate analysis, is that what we're seeing now is a kind of method being developed that might be used more broadly across the world, because we are going into an age of mass climate breakdown. At the same time, the economic relevance of the global north is diminishing. So we already see kind of US military doctrine, NATO military doctrines preparing for mass uprisings in the global south, specifically urban warfare.
I think here it's also quite telling how Katrina was already seen as something like, oh, Katrina happened, like a city basically fell for a natural disaster, and we go to Israel for the answers of how to deal with crowd control and racist policing of that situation. It is an escalation of treating climate as a war.
Yeah, and so basically, as the kind of demands from the global south will probably keep rising in the coming decades, many are thinking, and actually the Colombian president has also been saying this explicitly, that this might be kind of like a method, like a warning to the global south, get out of line, and this is what we'll have for you. And one writer, Tariq Sidio Amar, compared it kind of to what was called the Jakarta method in the Cold War.
What is that?
So the Jakarta method was this, is basically named after the massacre of about 1 million leftists in Indonesia in 1965 under the Suharto dictatorship, which was backed by the United States and Australia and various Western powers. And it was basically, it became this kind of model across the world that not just the US, but also its far right allies in Brazil, that they would literally say things like Jakarta is coming, or the Jakarta method is coming. So it became almost like an international symbol for counter-revolutionary forces of a method that they could apply to basically turn back the clock on revolutionary forces. And what we might be seeing in Gaza right now is actually those kind of methods being developed for the future. So yeah, I think
and we know that there's quite a track record of that military use of Palestine as a lab for
exactly
then exporting kind of methods of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide, kind of that escalation. And they've gone back and forth also learning from these situations, because what they've the way that they have trained in different dictatorships have also it's not been a single export. It's also been learning then from being situated, what is it, in Rhodesia or somewhere else, and then like applying that back on the Palestinians again. It's like kind of constantly learning how to violate indigenous and rebellious people. But yeah, in the context of climate change, I do really think that there's a huge this fight is always been for Palestine, but also for more than Palestine, as it's a lot more on the line of what goes in authoritarian politics concerns. And we're looking for a huge escalation in military politics. In the Netherlands, we hear things like we need to have a war economy now, and we hear that we're supposed to make the 2% GDP, Bruto National Product, investment in the military industry, which has been a doubling for the Netherlands. Like it came from around 1%, 1 point something. And now this year we are actually making this 2% GDP towards militarization. And we see that climate agreements like the Green Deal on a European level is being used for military to kind of invade that space and say, we have a role to play in national security, and we're getting money and mandate and rules that facilitate solving climate with more invasion to mine for certain things that we see as essential. But we've seen with COVID that certain things were seen as essential, and those were pretty much the things serving elite interest, and people and places were not seen as essential. So certain workers were totally sacrificed for what was essential and not essential. And I think like it's one thing to analyze that, but for it to really hit home and then affect our activism, like how do we learn from this when we go into the streets? I mean, this is a big question, but how do you navigate that? Kind of knowing that, really taking it in, that this is an upscaling of genocide, like as horrific as everything we've seen on our phones and on Instagram and other places, like that is a war coming home to the world.
I think, I mean, there's a lot to learn from Palestine. Of course, we're not inside Palestine. So the kind of tactics and strategies that we use will probably be very different within our context. But I think there is something to be said from learning from the spirit of resistance in Palestine, from the people who, in the face of incredible odds, we're not just talking about armed resistance, of course, which also takes incredible bravery, but we're talking also about people north of Gaza refusing to leave, children, families, people who basically refuse to give up and to give up their land. This sumut, this steadfastness, and I think that kind of spirit should be fueling our resistance here as well. And that also means that we're prepared to take risks. And again, that doesn't mean that we apply the same tactics. Of course, you need to think strategically about what works specifically here, but it does mean that we're willing to sacrifice. It does mean that we're willing to put in the time, the effort, the energy, that we realize what's at stake. There's often this saying of, that people often wonder what they would do during the Second World War, or when a genocide happens. Well, you're going through it right now. So it's a moment of truth, and of course it's important to mention that I do think, and I've written about this quite extensively, that the genocide in Gaza right now is really unprecedented for the 21st century. That being said, it is not unprecedented in history.
Well,
and
it is in a way that the military mechanisms are unprecedented, like the way that you have drone systems that make sounds of crying and people come out and it explodes, or the "Where's Daddy?" Like these kind of unprecedented tools of destruction that go into homes and explode, especially when they're home with their kids. It's not unprecedented as like genocides of mass destruction if we look at the whole continent of the Americas, or these places. But sorry, I interrupted you. I just wanted to mention that.
No, I agree. But no, the only point I was making is, of course, this is a kind of apocalyptic situation that people have gone through before, whether it's the genocide in the Americas from 1492 onwards. So we are in a history of resistance against this. It's not a vacuum. In a way, I sometimes like to compare what's going on in Gaza right now as kind of like the Haitian Revolution, when the Haitians basically said, the French Revolution just 2 years before had said, declared the rights of man, but they still believed in slavery. And they said, when you declare the rights of man, we are included in that. So it's kind of like a stand for where we are in the future. And I think we should take this long view and really see this as a really important moment. Like the Haitian Revolution was a key point for global revolution, for slave revolts across the Americas, but it also became a key point for developing thought about equality, about revolution, that informed all kinds of revolutionaries in the future. And I think
and a tipping point of a certain courage, of a certain imagination, like also with the encampments. Like I've been coming to protest for Palestine for a long time, and it's never been like, it's been a few thousand sometimes, but like to see what is happening now around the world, like encampments from US to Bangladesh. The last time I saw something that was as big, and not even as big, but like worldwide kind of thing. Yeah, it was kind of with like Occupy or something, but that had no political agenda. It was against something without an agenda, and it fueled people's experience of activism. And some people who were active then have gone on to be, amazing organizers. But I think this is with a really clear political agenda of liberating Palestine. And in that sense, it also feels like the resistance in the 16 years that I've been an active activist has never been at this level, where anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-genocide, and anti-imperialism kind of all
Yeah.
come together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder.
I fully agree, and I think this is because Palestine is such on the front, is such a key front line in the global struggle that all these things come together.
But then unfortunately, anti-militarism hasn't been that big.
Yeah.
Like that is something that does bother me, and I think it bothers you maybe a
Yeah,
little bit
yeah,
as
you know,
well.
I agree, but I do think actually the Palestine movement is what might bring a change to that, or what will help bring a change to that, because that has been a problem for a longer time, you know, for a
Yeah.
long time, and I totally agree. I'm very frustrated with that. I sometimes, I was, for example, I was involved in the student movement in 2015. It was quite historic. We, you know, liberated two huge buildings of the university for 2 months
Amsterdam.
in Amsterdam. But you know, it's kind of funny because I was asked a week before we started with that, and part of me, I supported the demands, but it was more about budget cuts and neoliberalization of education, which is bad. But I was more interested in anti-imperialist struggle.
Yeah.
There wasn't much going on.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, at least we get some experience, we learn how to do things, and you know, we can use it later for different means. So
that is happening now.
and that is happening now. So that's what I mean. Like I do think this will help to put that back on the agenda. Just like, you know, the Vietnamese war, the Vietnam War was also a huge part of developing anti-imperialist socialist struggles and anti-war struggles. That was a key turning point, and that was also and that was also very just as the resistance in Gaza plays a very important role in triggering the resistance here. Like sometimes people don't realize the anti-Vietnam War resistance. It was very coordinated, very planned by the Vietnamese resistance when they did the Tet offensive in '68. They meticulously planned not to cut any of the like radio and television lines to make sure that the media would record this huge offensive against the U.S. military, and it became it triggered a huge wave of protests across the world, and it just completely shattered this myth that the US was, you know, winning the war and doing everything fine and untouchable.
Yeah. Which also kind of, I mean, to such a large degree, all these despotic, dictatorship, imperialist regimes rely on instilling a lot of fear, and any counterattack kind of isn't just a mosquito bite in the empire, but it's breaking down some barriers of fear, because other people see like, hey, this is not untouchable. I want to bring it back because we've listed a whole long list of Israel exporting military arms, means surveillance to all these dictatorships and colonial regimes. But this is from 2012, and there's been more, unfortunately, after that. So we named Myanmar already, but Azerbaijan is another one that is recent. There's also a particular colonial dynamic, or I wonder if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Armenian, but by the way, and basically there's this small enclave called Artsakh, which was kind of disputed territory, but it has been indigenously populated by Armenians for at least 8,000 years. And basically what used to be disputed territory, but within, you know, tensions, people were still living there, and it was kind of, you know, a kind of frozen conflict status quo. In the last couple of years, Artsakh has been ramping up the pressure, Azerbaijan has been ramping up the pressure to take that territory and basically ethnically cleanse the Armenian population. This finally happened in 2023, very shortly actually before the genocide in Gaza started. And that happened specifically with Israeli weapons and Turkish weapons, but the last years before, estimates are that 70% of the weapons were coming from Israel, 40% of
That's a lot, 70%.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Quite considerable.
And it's not just that, you know, oh, they gave them weapons, they didn't know what was going to happen. Even like specifically weeks before the ethnic cleansing operation started, so more than 100,000 Armenians got ethnically cleansed. There were very intense shipments from military aircraft between Azerbaijan and Israel. So they were basically completely complicit in
Yeah.
that ethnic cleansing. And this is something that has been, quietly also, tolerated or, even supported by the EU and the United States. Although they kind of, they'll do like this feint, oh, we don't like this, but Azerbaijan gives the gas to the European Union. It has this geopolitical role. It has a lot of oil, so
Yeah.
they don't really care that much.
We haven't touched that much on oil and the Arab world, and also the entanglements of the United the AEU, the
UAE,
UAE.
United Arab Emirates, yes, sure. Yeah.
And yeah, countries around there, and the entanglement also with what's happening in, what is it, Sudan?
Yeah.
And how do you view that? Because there some loose ends. I've read certain things, but then there's different timelines and different. Yeah, I'm still learning. That's just
Yeah, so basically, we're talking about Sudan and the UAE, and
well, that there's a great report by, I want to say, Rachel. Well, you talk, I will look it up.
yeah, I'm just trying to clarify the exact question.
Yeah, Rachel Donald, Climate Wars Fueling Genocide in Sudan.
Right.
And that has more to do with the UAE. I always stumble over that. But in a bigger sense of the Saudi oil,
Basically, Israel's role with reactionary regimes in the region.
in the Arab
Yeah,
world,
yeah.
and kind of like, what are some of your observations there? So that's kind of an open question, but like also thinking about, I don't know, I think 40%, like that region is still 40% of oil still comes from
Right,
there.
yeah.
So like, how do those geopolitical oily relations tie in with the imperialist
Yeah, I mean,
relations?
the old revolutionary slogans from the 60s were always called the struggle against imperialism, Zionism, and Arab reaction. That third is sometimes forgotten. So, it has always been the case that that Israel is reliant on either the direct complicity or the kind of tolerance by reactionary, like right-wing regimes within the region, and those are often either a legacy of colonialism or neo-colonialism. The Saudi Kingdom was basically a UK creation, and after that backed by the US. The same goes for all the Gulf monarchies, basically. So the UAE, Qatar, etc. So this whole normalization drive that was there before the October 7th, of course, was also mainly with the reactionary governments in the region. And often they cannot basically, be as pro-Israel as, maybe Europe or the US will be, because, their own populations would be so vehemently against it.
Yeah.
You do see them kind of pushing the envelope as far as they can. And I do think this is clearly has a role within kind of their own counter-revolutionary nature. If you if you look at Saudi Arabia, for example, it's not just normalization with Israel. They would even we talked about the Contras in Nicaragua. They would also fund the Contras in Nicaragua, and you can wonder what is Saudi Arabia doing all the way in Nicaragua. Sometimes, sometimes the analysis is, is this Muslim fundamentalist Wahhabi. Of course, there is this ideological strain there, but the death squads they were funding were right-wing Christians.
Yeah.
So I think the really key thing binding all these countries is counter-revolution.
Yeah.
And those are international forces, just as revolutionary is an international force, counter-revolutionary, and they coordinate with each other, and they see their aligned interests. Even within the region, Saudi Arabia was very close with the Shah. It was a secular regime, but they were both counter-revolutionary. So I think this is the
politics first.
Politics first, yes.
Yeah, and it's crazy how much of our activism are still kind of limited to identity or all these other things, when we're skipping the politics first, like where are we actually in our political fight? Are we aligned politically? Can we build on each other? Can we trust each other politically?
Yeah.
Do you have any questions you want to bring into the conversation or something else?
I think maybe one thing I remember when I went through the zine you sent me beforehand, and I wanted to emphasize one of the countries that was named there a little bit more because I think it can be emphasized more, and that's Argentina. So the Argentinian junta under Fidela in 7 years' time. So they mentioned that he specifically targeted Jews, Jewish leftists. But the numbers are actually quite astonishing. So we know that they were disproportionately targeted from the known victims. If you would kind of assume that the same proportions within the unknown victims, it would be about almost 4,000 Jewish leftists murdered, tortured to death by the Argentinian junta. If we compare that, just to wrap your head around that, Israel's own numbers and they count since like 1860 of civilian Zionist victims in all the conflicts combined with all Arab countries and all Palestinians since 1860, they say it's 5,100. So we're talking about a period of more than 150 years is only slightly more civilian victims than during the Argentinian junta, which was supported by Israel. So this whole idea of, that Israel exists to defend Jews or to protect Jews or anything like that, it's so obviously ridiculous. They are, again, a counter-revolutionary regime allied with another counter-revolutionary regime.
Yeah.
And
And also like the US, that is the biggest ally of Israel, has really had a track record of supporting Nazis as well, even hiring Nazis after the Second World War, refusing Jewish kids in 1940. Like I think 20,000 Jewish kids appealed for kind of refuge in 1940. And I think it was under Roosevelt, and they said no. And the Bushes, the Kennedys, they all kind of went along with a certain alliance to Nazi. And I heard something in a talk recently about that there was a conversation around bombing the railways to the concentration camps, and they decided against it because it wasn't seen as strategic. And that goes on to say a lot.
There's really a lot more to say, but that's why I'm actually writing a book about this topic. So
let's this conversation to buy Chris's book. No, okay, so we should maybe go towards the wrap up. Maybe we can wrap it up with like maybe some tools, some websites, some sources that you would find maybe useful in wrapping your head around the scope of Israel exporting apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing to other parts of the world.
I mean, I think the zine already is
so the zine is online, and we will put the link in the description box. I also wanted to mention this database. It's the database of Israeli military and security export. It's been mentioned by different speakers that I've listened to that Israel doesn't publish a lot of these things. So these are kind of secret, but they're kind of open secrets because often countries that go on and buy arms from Israel, they kind of boast about it. They kind of say like, look, we've got the best. And so this researcher, let me look up their name. It is a lawyer. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Itai Mak is an Israeli lawyer and human rights activist located between Jerusalem and Oslo. There's a podcast on 972 Mag around Israel arms sale and genocide. It's interesting. And then at the database, you find more about different countries. It is organized by country. So you can look up the Netherlands and what is the relationship between the Netherlands and Israel. You can browse by product, like what kind of drones or policing or small arms. And you can also browse by company. So I think they started with 11 companies, including Elbit Systems, but also like NSO Group and Rafael and like others. So it's a great place to learn if the anti-militarist struggle or like this aspect of Palestinian solidarity is new to you.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so much, it's hard to say where to start exactly, but in general, Electronic Intifada, sites like that will have a lot of information. I mean, two books for the readers among us that go specifically into this kind of, Palestine as a laboratory for global repression are Jeff Halper, War Against the People, as well as the most recent one, the Palestine Laboratory, how Israel exports the technology of occupation around the world. So those are for more in-depth analysis on that. And maybe for the kind of more complex question of the relationship of the role of Israel within the region, I would in general recommend the writings of Ali Qadri. I think he's done great work on not just on Israel, but also US imperialism in the region and understanding kind of how that works in West Asia. So
let's also put that all in the links in the description box. We're very happy to share this zine and some reflection on the topic. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it for today.
yeah.
Thank you for joining and see you in another learning session.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.